Hello everyone, our topic this week was requested by The Outsider, and was something of an egocentric request as we'll be going over The Outsider himself from the Dishonored series.
Okay, so before getting into the Outsider himself, we need to explain the Void, as he is heavily attached to it. In the world of the Dishonored series, the Void is a strange mixture of place and concept. On the one hand, according to the Outsider himself, the Void is an old, strange thing that is capable of watching everyone in the world from within their very selves. On the other hand, the Void is also a physical location, with the Outsider often pulling the player into a space within the Void to talk throughout the course of the two games, inferring that the Void is both an aspect of reality, or the people in it, and a physical piece of that reality at the same time. As far as the Void as a location is concerned, it is a predominantly empty, ambiguously lit space, with floating stone islands making up all known terrain in the Void. Though the physical exactitudes of what is seen in the Void are said to be influenced by those who see it, with the terrain often having contextless images related to current in-game events being displayed. A location, a person, a still of an event, etc. Along those same lines, it is worth noting that the ambient background of the Void is depicted very differently in Dishonored's 1 and 2, with the Great Expanse of Nothing being a dully lit blue in the first game, almost as if it were in a bubble underwater, while in the second game the Void is darker and more gray. Whether this is simply a design choice, a reflection of the difference in the protagonist's states of mind between games 1 and 2, or related to events regarding the Outsider himself is unknown. As a final but important note, the Void is also, as far as the player is shown, the source of all magic within the Dishonored games.
The Outsider is, for lack of any better term, the avatar of the Void. The Void either has at least a modicum of sentience, or perhaps some semblance of an active will, and according to the series' creators, the Void craves the existence of a representational godlike entity, in this case, the Outsider. For the record, we tend to scoff at the term God when used in most media because the characters in question tend to be incredibly mortal and nowhere near powerful enough to qualify as gods, at least in our opinions. For a simple example, the summons from Final Fantasy XV, as referenced in our Arden video 2 weeks ago, are considered gods in that reality, despite the fact that 2 of them have been slain, one by mortal hands, and one was enslaved by a mere mortal. Keeping that opinion in mind, the Outsider is probably the godlike entity most deserving of the title that we have personally encountered in a very long time. From his place within the Void, the Outsider can look at events taking place throughout the world, and inferences are made that he can also peer through time. However, time is very fluid in this reality. History is written only by the choices and actions of the people living their lives. As such, while intelligent, the Outsider is not shown to be omniscient, as he will regularly express his surprise or lack thereof concerning the way the player conducts himself throughout both games, indicating that while he can foresee, at least to a certain degree, future events, he is not capable of parsing the results with 100% accuracy.
That being said, despite his lack of omniscience, the Outsider appears to be the next best thing to omnipotent. He appears to have near complete control over the Void itself, can travel from there to anywhere in the world, he can pull anyone from anywhere into the Void as well. It should also be noted that the Void seems to serve as, or bleed into, a dream realm, as there are multiple instances of people encountering the Outsider in dreams. But there are also several instances throughout the games that we know involve the player physically standing in the Void as well. So it's not entirely clear whether or not the Outsider can pull people physically into the Void or only grab hold of their consciousness. He can speak and interact with the player while others are nearby without allowing anyone else to notice him. He appears to be simultaneously aware of all events occurring in the world at once, or at the very least can watch and or know almost anything he desires to know simply by thinking about it. Finally, and most obviously for the player, the Outsider can grant power to mortals, most commonly by giving them his mark. Like a person's interaction with the Void, the abilities granted by the mark seem to differ from person to person, with a core set of abilities being common to all users in one form or another, but with most users also bearing unique powers on top of the standard ones shared by everyone. Because these powers are granted by the Outsider and the Void, it can be assumed that the Outsider can emulate all the powers seen in the games, and likely more. Some of those marked by the Outsider can even grant lesser variations of their powers to others. with more than one faction in the games having a marked leader and resultantly common units with a similar suite of abilities. This brings us to what might be the Outsider's only real weakness, as he almost never interacts directly with the world outside of those he chooses to mark. This originally led us to hypothesize that his powers, while great, had to be used through another, a mortal, in order to affect the real world. However, part of what made that theory make sense was that, to our knowledge, no one has ever borne his mark unwillingly. As such, the final DLC for Dishonored 2 makes this weakness seem less plausible, as he forces abilities in the form of a void-touched arm and eye on the protagonist during that DLC, despite the protagonist wanting little to do with the Outsider.
Which brings us to the defining aspect of the Outsider's character. The Outsider is generally considered a neutral entity, spending most of his time simply watching the life of mortals and the passage of time without interfering. Watching, cataloging, remembering, and silently judging. When he does interfere, he tends to do so with nudges rather than more overt actions, nearly always acting through intermediaries, whispering ideas to people in dreams, or granting power via his mark. The Outsider doesn't gift his mark to just anyone, however. There are numerous cults that exist throughout the world that revere him, hoping for guidance or power in return for their fealty. But the Outsider doesn't care for these cultists any more than he hates those who belong to a quasi-religious order that vilifies him as a plague on the world. He tends to offer his power only to those he considers interesting. The more intriguing the individual in question, the better, and as far as we can tell, the Outsider's major criteria for what makes a person interesting tends to be the fact that, with or without the Outsider's abilities, the person in question is going to play a pivotal role in history. For example, in-game, the world's equivalent to Einstein, Tesla, or the like, spends his life revolutionizing the world with his genius, and actively seeks the Outsider's favor for a taste of his power, but fails to garner the Outsider's interest. Conversely, of the known mark-bearers across both Dishonored games, 4 of them play major roles in determining the rulership of the local empire, and at one point during the first game, the Outsider comments that, at that time, only 8 people in the world bore his mark.
All indications are that the Outsider's primary interest in investing mortals with his power seems to be a curiosity regarding what people will do when given power. The game employs a high versus low chaos system to determine how events proceed, which is in layman's terms the player being bad or good respectively. Which is interesting because despite all official accounts claiming that he is a truly neutral character, the Outsider nearly always seems pleasantly surprised if the protagonist uses their newfound abilities judiciously, indicating a slight lean towards preferring the low chaos approach, instead of the high chaos approach. Though that apparent leaning could have as much to do with several lifetimes of experience watching humanity abuse power as it could with anything else. In fact, the Outsider's first introduction to great power in general, and the Void specifically, came from just such an abuse of power. 4,000 years before the events of the first Dishonored game, the Outsider was a mortal, with a name. He was a street urchin of seemingly little import, but he was picked up by a group of cultists, not unlike those that would worship him in later millennia. As previously mentioned, the Void hungers for an avatar, which means, among other things, that the Outsider was not the first godlike entity bound to the Void, nor, likely, will he be the last. Numerous other Void gods had held the position before him. Some were forgotten, others destroyed or slain, while still others were finally consumed by the Void itself. Because of this, 4,000 years ago, during the Outsider's mortal lifetime, the position of Void God was vacant, and the cult found him and determined that he had all of the metaphysical characteristics necessary to become the next avatar of the Void. As such, they plucked him off the street, made him look nice, and then enacted the ritual that ended with them physically inside the Void and slit the then mortal Outsider's throat, tearing away all living knowledge of his name, granting him status as Avatar of the Void, and making the blade used in the ritual the only known method by which his now otherwise immortal life could be ended.
From there, he grew and watched. For thousands of years, the Outsider watched humanity repeat similar cycles of behavior over and over and over, seemingly fascinated by not only the concept of choice, but on the ramifications of those choices for the world at large, watching as time and again, with his aid and without, those with power abused those who had none. So it came to be that on occasion, he would find people with great roles to play in the world and then see what they did if they were given more power to play those same roles. He gave power to a man who then used that power to become the foremost assassin in the realm, eventually even assassinating the Empress. He gave power to a bastard daughter of the Emperor, who used that power to rise through society and seek the throne that she felt was hers by right. He gave power to the bodyguard and lover of a murdered Empress, and watched with interest as that bodyguard cleaned up the mess. He gave power to that same bodyguard years later, when the new Empress was threatened, or, depending upon the player's choice, that very Empress herself. Each time he watched with fascination as they chose to abuse or responsibly wield the power he had given them.
It should be noted that, canonically speaking, it seems that each game and each DLC ended with a low chaos or good guy ending, meaning that the outsider was pleasantly surprised with the results of his mortal pawn's efforts. So in Dishonored 1, he watches with admitted surprise as Corvo, the protagonist, proceeds through the game after the murder of his Empress and beloved without murdering those responsible, and going even further when the Empress apparent, Emily, his daughter, is abducted twice. He once again handles things without leaving a mountain of corpses in his wake. Similarly, in the first game's DLC, the outsider watches in surprise as Dowd, the Empress-slaying assassin, spares lives in a manner not unlike that of Corvo, including the life of his traitorous lieutenant. 15 years later, in Dishonored 2, Corvo had guided Emily to be a wise empress, and during an attempted coup, either Corvo or Emily are turned into stone, and the one who escapes draws the outsider's attention. He offers his power, either again or for the first time, depending upon who you play. Corvo's powers were stolen during the coup. Interestingly, in Dishonored 2, the player can refuse the outsider's power, but he still jumps in with hints and his thoughts on the player's progress throughout the game, indicating that his interest in the player's choices is in no way lessened by the refusal of his gifts. Probably because that's sort of his whole deal, but his interest is likely also heightened by the fact that the orchestrator of the coup has bound herself to the outsider after finding the location of his sacrificial death, deep within the void, giving her the power she needed to stage the coup in the first place, and creating a connection that the outsider admitted to finding distasteful. Which is why, canonically speaking, the outsider was probably once again surprised at the player's restraint when those responsible for the coup are not murdered outright in response.
Finally, a couple months after the events of Dishonored 2, in the DLC Death of the Outsider, his story comes to a close. Dowd and his once traitorous lieutenant join forces to end the outsider's life once and for all, having decided that no one being could be trusted with deciding who did and who didn't get the power of the void. After all, look at the monstrous things Dowd and others had done with that power. No doubt fully capable of stopping them in their quest, the outsider instead empowers Billy, Dowd's lieutenant, and aids her in her quest to reach and assassinate him, just as he had aided and watched Dowd, Corvo, and possibly Emily before her. Eventually, Billy's quest leads her to the site of the outsider's sacrifice some 4,000 years prior, and rather than fight or challenge her at all, the outsider simply allows her to decide his fate, as always, fascinated by the intricacies of choice.
By then, Billy had learned many things, including the fact that the mark the outsider grants as a symbol of his power is in fact his forgotten name, decipherable only by the dead. As with most other major decisions in these games, the player has the choice of what happens next. Billy can either kill the outsider as planned, or convince Dowd, now a ghost, having passed on earlier in the game, to read the outsider's mark and tell the outsider his long-lost name. Either way, the outsider's connection to the void is severed, either through murder or freedom, and the void is left without an avatar. Because every other canon ending in this series up to this point was the low chaos ending, it seems logical to believe the same is true for this DLC, meaning that Billy realized and acknowledged the fact that the outsider didn't choose anything for them, that the powers they'd gained were always theirs to do with what they would, so if the choices they made were laudable, great, but if the choices they made were reprehensible, then that was on them and no one else. Knowing that the outsider had never chosen his place as the outsider, Billy convinced Dowd to free him and let him choose his path in life, existentially freeing Billy from the fear that all she could ever be was a murderer in the process, while also allowing Dowd's spirit to pass on in peace. Something it is inferred does not happen should the outsider be slain instead.
And that's basically the outsider, void god or avatar of the Dishonored series. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and maybe show it to a friend you think might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see us do in the future, do like The Outsider and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos from us in the future, be they lore or let's play, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
In the meantime, this has been True Masters and Morons, signing off. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like it, hit this subscribe orb.
To see our last Let's Play, click or tap the link on the right.
For our last lore video, go to the link on the left.
And for a video chosen by the gods of YouTube from our channel, hit that link on top.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.